now let me turn to the topic for today. The topic, of course, is Bush, Gore, and the presidency. And let me just start out by talking about the century. This is 1999. The election for President of the United States will take place in the year 2000. And we all know that it's part of the 20th century, but everybody thinks it's part of the 21st. So we're not going to change public awareness, right? When the year 2000 comes, it's the next century, is that right? So we're at the end of the 20th century. And what we need to do is to look back at America and the presidency over the last century to get perspective on what's going to happen. Because there are certain consistent agendas that have been around in the 20th century, circulating, confronting each other, seeking political parties to represent them. Because it is not the case that a political party represents a particular agenda all the time. A political party is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for power. And therefore, it may be the case that liberals capture the party, and it may be the case that what? Conservatives capture the party, and they have different agendas. The party is there to be captured and seized. And the big question, certainly in 1999 and 2000, is who's going to take the Republican Party, and what will the Democrats do in response? So let me take you back 100 years. 100 years ago, 1899, 1900, the President of the United States was William McKinley. And he was a Republican, and the Republicans had been in power almost continuously since the Civil War, with the exception of a Democrat who made it twice. His name was Grover Cleveland. But otherwise, it was a Republican world, and in 1900, America was run by Republicans, and the president was Republican. 1900 was the year when the United States of America was beginning to feel itself not only to be a power in the Western Hemisphere, but was beginning to feel itself a world power, which was to define the nature of America and the presidency for the 20th century. In fact, a war had been fought with Spain in 1898. We call it the Spanish-American War. And that war didn't last very long. I mean, Spain was not much of an adversary. And out of that war, America suddenly discovered it had an empire. It had become a world power, an imperial power. Not only did it control Cuba, not only had it annexed Puerto Rico, it was all the way across the Pacific. It had taken Guam and now the Philippines, and was now asserting itself as a world power. In 1900, something was happening, especially in New York. Thousands and thousands of people were crossing the Atlantic Ocean and arriving at Ellis Island. The United States of America was an extraordinary experiment. It's called the import of cheap labor. And it was going on not in a small scale, as is happening now. It was going on in a massive scale, beginning to transform America, because at the beginning of this century, the overwhelming majority of the people in the United States of America, certainly in the North, were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Right? And certainly at the end of the 20th century, that is not true. So if you're running for president in 1900, as McKinley did for his second term, he is running for an audience that no longer exists. You're talking to a different audience. And that audience changes, and if you are in a democracy, the character of that audience is crucial. They are your voters. And the way you talk to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants is different from the way you talk to Catholics, or the way you talk to blacks or Hispanics, or Asians. The population of the United States of America has radically altered in this century. Now, in 1900, there were issues that were circulated. When McKinley ran for president, there were basic issues. And the first was the power of big business. Now, that issue has been with us throughout the century. I want to make a distinction between big business and small business. People often make a distinction between business and labor, assuming that that is the major tension. There are those people who are in business, and then they employ labor, and the main tension is between business and labor. But if you look at this century, and this issue is still with us, one of the big issues, you see, is the competition always between big business and small business. Think of all the small stores that used to exist in this country. America was built on what? Small stores, small business. By 1900, you could feel the power, the rising power of the big businesses that were part of the new industrial complexes. It was the beginning of the development of the big department stores, all of this. Now, big business tends to gobble up small business and to gobble up other big businesses. And ultimately, if you don't stop it, what you end up with is a second government. Not an elected government, but a government of leaders of big business who now establish monopolies. And therefore, what was formerly free enterprise is no longer free enterprise because there is no real competition. Now, that was a very big issue in 1900. By the way, it still remains an issue in 2000. It's interesting how issues remain. One of the issues was the poverty of workers. Enormous profits were made, but it was not true that the workers benefited all the time from the success of these corporations and the success of big business, and that led to something else, which was very controversial in 1900. It's controversial in 2000, but the mood of the public has changed. It's called unions. All right? When I was a child in the 30s, if you said union, on my block, everybody cheered. They thought it was terrific. But now, if I go around in many, many places, especially since the opening of the Detroit teachers' strike, if I say union, the response is very, very different from what it was, in many cases, 100 years ago. But one of the big issues was the right of labor to organize. Was it a conspiracy to restrain free trade? And in fact, in many places, unions were prohibited from operating and from striking, and that was a big issue. One of the prices of big business, you see, which was a big issue in 1900, and is an issue again in 2000, because I'm going to talk about Patrick Buchanan. You know about him? By the way, he's a lot more charismatic than George Bush Jr. But it's all right. You may not agree with his agenda, but he's there, and it's related to this issue. Big business, in order to get bigger, needed to keep out the products of competitors from other nations, in particular European nations, that could produce even more efficiently. And the way America answered that, and it was the policy of the Republican Party, was to raise tariffs, to make it very, very expensive for foreign goods to enter this country. And so that was a very big issue, because it meant that for the poor, they didn't derive that much benefit from the the profits of the corporation, and simultaneously the cost of the products they needed for their life were far more expensive because cheaper imports were restricted. One of the big issues, since the Republican Party was committed to the gold standard, was that there was a shortage of money. It was hard to get money. Money was expensive. And therefore, the people who had the readiest access to money were the people of great wealth and the great corporations, because they were intimately related to the banks. The banks and the great corporations, they went together. The people who had small access to money were people in small business and people who were farmers, right? I mean, money was very, very expensive. And back in 1896, William McKinley ran his campaign against perhaps the most charismatic figure in American politics, William Jennings Bryan, who said that we will not crucify America on a cross of gold. Already by 1900, there was another issue. It had been brought about by urbanization and the Industrial Revolution. It's attached to a whole series of issues that dominate the election in 2000. That's the continuity. Already by 1900, there were groups of women marching around with placards. And they were asking to vote. They were called suffragettes, and you may have had relatives who were members of that movement. But it's not true that the feminist movement began with Betty Friedan. She would like to think it did, but it doesn't, and it didn't. The feminist movement began a long time ago. It goes all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. And certainly one of the first crusades was the right to education. And the second one was the right to vote. And that was a very, very important issue because there were many, many rich people who wanted their women to vote. And there were many, many poor people who didn't. So now I want to point out a problem. It's one of the problems that plagues the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and creates confusion in trying to talk about right or left. Many rich people are what I call liberated. They like divorce, they like sexual liberation, the whole thing. Move around. What they don't like is taxes. And there are many poor people who would like some welfare and maybe some more unions and whatever else it is, who may be very religious, who don't think it appropriate for their wives to vote. It's not true that if you're poor, you're liberal on all issues, or if you're rich, you are conservative on all issues. It's all what? It's mixed. And the feminist issue is one of those issues because there's now a whole series of other things attached to it. If you're talking about abortion, abortion is part of the feminist issue, the freedom of women, the rights of women, all of it. It was there in 1900, and it remained. Do you see the continuity? Through the whole century, it's up and down, it turns a little bit, whatever else it is. There is the issue. It's there. And certainly one of the issues that's still with us. Already by 1900, as the flood of foreigners poured into this country. I mean, it was one thing to have the Irish. And then it was another thing to have the Germans. But when they started with the Italians and the Poles and the Jews, and then they picked up the Syrians, and then other people from the Middle East and the Far, whatever it was, the American population got scared. And by 1900, you had very, very vicious, racist propaganda. And there were strong demands to close the door. I just read in a Canadian newspaper a few days ago, there's a big issue now in Canada. Thousands and hundreds of thousands of Chinese are pouring in from China into British Columbia and Canada. The population of Vancouver may be one-half Asian, or certainly one-half of the student population at the University of British Columbia is. And now the issue is, well, we're not racist, but how do we stop it? Otherwise, our whole country will be inundated. It will be changed. It's nice to have a few Chinese restaurants in Windsor, but I mean, there's a limit. Now, that immigration issue is attached to another issue which is still with us. What does it mean to be an American? In 1900, for many, many people, to be an American was to be white. Understand their image was to be white. It was to be Anglo-Saxon. It was to be Protestant. That is what it meant to be an American. So somebody from Asia or somebody of Indian origin from Latin America was unacceptable. Now, that race issue is still with us. Still a big issue. It is sometimes phrased in 1999 more discreetly. But it is still there. It's still a main issue, and certainly the success of the Republican Party over the last 30 years has been that it has been identified by many people in this country as a party for white people. Blacks were generally associated with, and Hispanics with, the Democratic Party. So now I want to give you 4 agendas. They are 4 consistent agendas that have gone through the whole 20th century. They were there in 1900, and they're still around, and they're juggling. The people who are part of this agenda are always looking for a political party that will embrace their agenda. It isn't that the party has the agenda. The party is what? An opportunity for power. If you take control of the party, then what? You get the power. So the 4 agendas are the following. The first agenda is not what I call conservative, because historically it does not have deep roots in terms of society. I call it the capitalist agenda. Capitalism and the Industrial Revolution are new. We're talking about 2.5 centuries. It's pretty new. It's certainly younger than the family. It's certainly younger than religion. It's certainly younger than farming. The capitalist agenda was generally identified with big business. The most successful elements of the capitalist revolution were the great corporations that were now involved in manufacturing and the banks that were attached to them. And there was a very, very, very clear agenda. Now, the number of people who embraced this agenda was not large. But the resources to reinforce the agenda were great. It's called money. Because with money you can buy newspapers, with money you can move into the media. That is still an issue now. The whole issue between Democrats and Republicans over the use of soft money to support political campaigns. Do you allow large sums of money coming from very wealthy corporations to enter into the political campaign and to distort it by virtue of the influence of a small number of people who have access to this money? The second agenda, which was not exclusively Democratic. In fact, the word was first used by certain Republicans. Is called the progressive agenda. The progressive agenda recognized all the problems that were happening in America in 1900. There was a problem with poverty, and there was the problem with big business and monopoly, and there was the problem with not allowing the unions, and there was the problem of education, that many, many people who were immigrants were unable to get access to appropriate education, and many people who were poor farmers didn't have access to appropriate education. So the progressives were interested in using government to make reforms. Spend more money on education. Give the vote to women. Pass laws restricting trusts, and monopolies, the whole thing. And the center of the progressive movement, to a large degree, was to be found, interestingly enough, in the Midwest, and many of the people who promoted this were Republicans. So I want to point out, you have to get rid of what I call stereotypes. Do you understand? After all, a political party is simply an opportunity for power. And in fact, for many, many progressives, since the Republicans were the major party, the party of power, for them, it made more sense to try to get hold of the Republican Party than the Democratic Party that would lose. Plus, the Democratic Party was attached to an element in the South that was deeply, deeply, deeply racist and conservative. The third is called the radical agenda. The radical agenda was to be found mainly in the big cities, certainly of the East. The overwhelming majority of the American population in 1900 was located in the East, the Northeast, and the Midwest. They hadn't found Palm Springs yet, or Scottsdale, or even Fort Lauderdale or Palm Beach. None of that had been really discovered except by a very small number of people, not many at that time. So, and in the big cities where there was industrialization, your New York, your Philadelphia, your Chicago, your Pittsburgh, there were groups of people now who felt that the only way to solve the problem was through some fundamental change. At the beginning of the century, around 1900, there arose a very strong movement in America, which was to be strong until the end of the Second World War. It's called socialism in all its varieties, whether it's mild form or more radical form by Eugene Debs, but all of it. But it was there, it was a radical alternative, and it wasn't merely progressives. Progressives wanted to reform the existing system. The socialists wanted to change it in some way, and many of their ideas were interesting. They wanted to guarantee health care for all, in particular the aged. That was a socialist idea. Now, if I talk about Medicare in Peoria, Illinois, to a Republican audience, they think it's a Republican idea. Do you understand? But in 1900, that was a, got the whole thing? It's all over. That was a socialist idea. And what I want to point out, and it's very important for understanding the 20th century, many of the ideas that were labeled socialist in 1900 are now deeply embedded in the fabric of what we call the American economy. What used to be regarded as radical has now become accepted even by conservatives. But it was a radical element, and their strategy initially was not to try to take over the Democratic or Republican Party. Their strategy was to organize themselves either for protest, demonstration, and ultimately, who knows, revolution. It was not a large group, but it was much larger than it is today. Now, the last group is very important because we're dealing with them in this election, and they've been around for a long time. I call them the conservatives. Now, I made a distinction between the capitalist agenda and the conservative agenda because many, many people who endorse the capitalist agenda were not interested in what I call the historic conservative agenda. So let me talk about this conservative agenda. America started out as a land of farmers as a people attached to farms and small towns. America started out as a nation with families in which the role of women was primarily to have children. If you lived on a farm, that was the labor you produced for the farm. So there was a whole ideology that defined this lifestyle, and attached to it was a very important element. And that was religion. Because the ethics of this culture, which today we might call family values, all right, was reinforced by historic religion, by the ways of one's ancestors. And so all of it came together, and it was a very, very powerful force. It wasn't well politically organized, but it was there. Now, the people in all four agendas and the leaders throughout this whole century have been trying to get hold of the two main parties of power. What is true of America is that certainly over the last 150 years, third parties don't what? They don't work. We are a nation in which there are two parties you work through. One party gets into power, the other party loses power. On the national level, there are two prizes. One is the presidency, the other is the Congress. Well, let me talk about how each of these agendas fared. How did they operate through the 20th century? So let me talk about the capitalist agenda. The capitalist agenda was very successful in taking control of the Republican Party. No doubt about it. Very, very successful. And if I look at the presidents in the 20th century of the United States of America, an overwhelming number of them endorsed that agenda, which basically was, don't interfere with big business, keep taxes low. It was mainly an economic agenda. William McKinley, the century began with him. William Howard Taft, who was a rather formidable presence, who was the president from 1909 to 1913. Harding, who had an interesting sexual life like Clinton, in the presidential office, and then died while in office. Calvin Coolidge from New England, who said very, very little because he didn't want to do anything. For him, the way things were is the way they should remain, and therefore talking about anything would only disturb things. Herbert Hoover. And then its agenda is revived again with perhaps the most significant figure of all in this agenda. And I will talk about him because in many of the circles in which I move, he's not one of the most popular people. But he's certainly one of the great presidents of the 20th century. I never voted for him, but that doesn't mean that I can't be objective. Do you want to? His name is Ronald Reagan, and he and Maggie Thatcher have changed do you understand the whole attitude of people toward how government should function? Very, very important. And then his addition, whose name was Bush, remember him? George, the father of the present candidate. From the beginning, the agenda had a problem. The number of people who were interested in this agenda to vote for it was essentially a small group. In a democracy, in order to win the election, you have to persuade others to vote for your agenda. So the only way this agenda worked was that the capitalist agenda made an alliance with other agendas. Life is all negotiation. Do you understand? Negotiation. So you need another group. So you have to give in a little bit, because otherwise, if you want your way completely, you will get nothing. So now let me move on to the next agenda, because it relates to this alliance. The next agenda is the progressive agenda. And the first person to dramatically embrace it was not a Democratic president. The first person who used the word progressive over and over and over again was a man by the name of Teddy Roosevelt. And he was a very controversial figure in the Republican Party, because there were many people who were the old leaders of the Republican Party who felt that he was subversive. He was in favor of legislation to break monopolies. He was in favor of expanding educational opportunity. And Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive president. And then he was followed by William Howard Taft. And then the second progressive president was Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson got into power because the Republican Party split. Now they're talking about the split again. The splitting, they keep talking about it, the presidential election. Split over this issue. Taft, the capitalist agenda. Teddy Roosevelt, as under the progressive ticket, running on the progressive program. And they were fighting each other, and therefore Wilson was able to come through. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, stimulated by the advent of the Depression. Harry Truman. Now, I put Dwight D. Eisenhower there. Let me just say something. No real attempt was made to undo the work of the New Deal until we get to Ronald Reagan. They talked it, but they didn't touch it. And in fact, Dwight D. Eisenhower certainly had his allies in big business, but in the end, most of the New Deal legislation was not assaulted. The Republican Congress sometimes did, and there were modifications. And so what followed Eisenhower, there was Roosevelt, then Truman, then Eisenhower. What followed was Kennedy, who was certainly part of the progressive agenda, and then Johnson with the Great Society and all the great wonders of the welfare system that we in the middle class wish to keep in place, including Medicare. One of the false impressions about Richard Nixon doesn't mean he was a nice guy. One of the false impressions was that he undid the agenda. He didn't. In fact, the budget didn't change. The welfare benefits did not radically alter under the Nixon administration at all. And certainly with Carter, there begins a modification of how the progressive agenda will be articulated. But it's not until you get to Ronald Reagan that you get what I call an ideological assault, a real strong, powerful ideological assault on the progressive agenda. Now, what happened to the progressives which was to help the Republicans was that they split. Let me just articulate the causes of the split. At one time, the Republicans lost power. They lost power in 1932. The Democrats moved in. The progressives all united behind Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But after World War II, as prosperity settled in, the progressives sort of split. May happen in your family, so I'll try to talk about it. One are the left progressives. The left progressives say, the unions are always good no matter what. We love the unions. The left progressive. The welfare system ought not to be tampered with in any way, shape, and form, even in an affluent society. There are all these... We need special guarantees that people from minority groups have access, right, to power. It's called affirmative action. right progressives. They've now moved to Bloomfield Hills. Or they may be in Trenton. I don't know. They can be different places. They say, you know what? Unions used to be what? Very good, but now, you know, they're too demanding, and they get benefits that exclude other people who need access to them. Well, yes, I think it's appropriate for us to provide care for the aging. Social Security and Medicare are fine, but we certainly don't want that welfare system that keeps the what? Those parasites there. And then, on affirmative action, they say, well, I don't think it's fair that we should judge anybody on the basis of race. Don't get me wrong, I'm progressive. I don't wish to undermine all these reforms, but that's not fair. So a kind of split. Affluence created a split between left progressives and right progressives. And now you have an alliance. You have the alliance that Ronald Reagan ultimately was able to create. That alliance was capitalist agenda, and he picked up what I call the right progressive. Over there. And they moved over on the race issue. They weren't crazy about affirmative action. And he was going to pick up another agenda that I'll talk about very shortly. But first, let me talk about the radical. The radical agenda is rather interesting. When the New Deal came to power, many of the ideas that had been proposed by the Socialist Party were adopted by the New Deal and became part of the progressive movement, from Social Security to whatever else, even establishing government jobs, the WPA. All of these ideas were incorporated into the New Deal. But what ultimately killed the radical agenda, from which it never recovered, was the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And by 1945 and 1946, it was very clear that any attachment to anything called socialist would be regarded as subversive, anti-patriotic, and the radical movement simply died away. They reappeared for a short while at the end of the 60s in something called the New Left. But the New Left had no chance to succeed because the people who sponsored the New Left weren't the workers. The people who sponsored the New Left were the children of the rich who didn't want to go to war. So in the end, the New Left was a romantic movement that had no foundation. It ultimately what? Collapsed. So the radical agenda has pretty much been finished in America. It has no political base anymore. But now I want to come to an agenda which is critical to understanding Bush and Gore, because both Bush and Gore deal with it. And only this past week they both addressed it. It's called the conservative agenda. The conservative agenda is pre-capitalist. The conservative agenda goes back to farm, family, and religion. The conservative agenda says we've got to preserve the culture and the ways of our fathers. The first expression of the conservative agenda was racial. It was the attack at the beginning of the 20th century on more immigrants. And in fact, in 1921 and 1924, in alliance with the Republican Party, the conservatives closed the door to immigration to America. The second agenda was women and women's power. Now, you'll notice that following World War I, because all these women, were utilized in the war, female suffrage was granted. But almost immediately after, the conservatives, using the Republican Party, came back with their answer. Their answer was prohibition. Oh, remember that? No drinking. Drinking is Catholic. We're not going to alter the culture, to enter the Protestant culture of America. But then the conservative agenda returned to race. In the 1960s, as the Black Power movement arose, the conservative agenda now turned to defending white America. And in fact, they embraced almost overwhelmingly the Republican Party and gave the South, took the South away from the Democrats and gave it to the Republicans. It wasn't on the capitalist agenda, it was on the conservative agenda. But by the late 80s and 90s, it is very clear as the population of America is changing that if you don't pay attention to African Americans or Hispanics or whatever, you're never going to win any election. So now the shift is to another issue. It's called religion. And in fact, the old ways will be defended by religion. It's very, very interesting that now one of the most strident spokesmen for the conservative agenda is a talk show host, black man, by the name of Alan Keyes. Have you seen? Oh, he is PhD from Harvard. He is charismatic. He wants to be president of the United States. And he gets up there and he says, there are two kinds of Republicans. Money is God Republicans. You know who those are. Those are just the capitalists. And God is God Republicans. Oh, that's me. Now that's a change that a black man would represent, would be the spokesperson for this agenda, is obviously a change in the conservative agenda. The conservatives have now dropped the racial issue because it is no longer productive of success, and now they want to be able to incorporate a wider constituency into their agenda. Well, let me mention the issues that what I call the conservative agenda now deals with. They're all tied up with God and religion. Abortion, right? It's a big issue. Still is. Homosexuality, still a what? Big issue. Euthanasia, still a big issue. Can you believe that in the United States of America, a nation that was built by the wonders of modern science and scientific inquiry, that a state board of education should remove evolution as a fundamental principle of biology? Can you believe it? Like, I was embarrassed. Is this happening in America? I mean, is it happening in America? At the end, I mean, at the end of the 20th century? Happening here? Prayer? Put the Ten Commandments up on the school wall, say prayers, and morality will be there. And guns, which is rather interesting. Guns, which are instruments of violence. Their ownership is part of a traditional lifestyle, isn't it? Every farmer has a what? Yeah, I'm going to take his gun away. So interestingly enough, this agenda has been through the whole set. Got it? But they keep changing the tactic because, you know, depending on the constituency you're dealing with. And now comes the man who arranged the Great Coalition, Ronald Reagan. You may have thought he was suffering from early Alzheimer's. You may have thought he was vacuous, whatever. I want to tell you something. One of the most successful presidents around. And he put together an alliance which gave the Republican Party great power. He really helped to revive it. He gave it a very strong ideology. And he brought together three agendas: the capitalist one, the right progressives, and the conservatives. Because at the end of the 1980s, there was Jerry Falwell and the others, and they're moving in, and now they have coalition. And in fact, if those three groups stay together, you've got an overwhelming majority. There it is. Unbeatable. Now, the way the Democrats responded to Reagan was to build their coalition around the left progressives. So you go to a meeting and, there was Walter Mondale. He would get up and it would all sound familiar, but what? It wasn't going to win an election. Reagan had it all put together. And the question was, could the Republican Party continue to maintain that alliance? Could they continue to maintain that alliance? If they did, they what? Invincible, invulnerable. Well, they didn't deal with this man from Arkansas. In between sexual escapades, I don't know what it was. I was unable to finish Bill and Hillary because it's just, it's too much already. And now I just read this article about how he plays golf. I mean, it's okay. So in between all of that, he emerges, and quite frankly, Bill Clinton happens to be one of the most charismatic presidents of the 20th century. You may not like how he uses his charisma, but that he is a charismatic president is what? You can't deny it. He gets up, talks, can talk on anything. Give him any subject, he's talking away, he's got all this information and everything. And he had an idea which was resisted by the old leadership of the Democratic Party. It was he who helped to create the Democratic Leadership Council, and the idea was, in order for us to defeat the Republicans, what we need to do is to wean two groups away from the Reagan coalition. Because both the right progressives and the capitalists aren't crazy about these crazy conservatives. And so Clinton now did redefine the whole Democratic Party. And in 1992, when it was very clear the conservatives were running the convention of the Republican Party, not the capitalists, the conservatives, Clinton now came out with this whole new program, right? Not welfare, but workfare. Moving over. Affirmative action, yes. Got the whole thing? The one thing all of them agreed on: we would not give in to the conservative agenda. There should be abortion freedom, do you understand, and rights for whatever, and so forth and so on. There it is. And he was successful. The reason why Clinton won was he didn't separate the whole capitalist constituency, but part of it, and many of the right progressives, he brought them over to the Democratic Party, and now he had strung together a successful coalition. A coalition which ultimately was to serve him well. Because when his sexual escapades put him in peril and he was impeached, and the impeachment in a Republican Congress was done and led by the conservatives, American public opinion was opposed to the impeachment. And opposed to the conviction, which now indicated that a majority of the American people rejected the conservative agenda. So one of the ways to build a democratic victory is to always label the Republicans as the mouth of the religious right. So now the Republicans are in trouble. They're out of power, and those conservatives are very strong. But the Democrats are also in trouble. I mean, after all, you can't ignore all the damage that Clinton did by his behavior. I mean, you know we don't want him impeached or convicted or removed, whatever. We don't like those conservatives, but after all, the man lied, and look at the behavior, even in golf. So, can his trusted lieutenant, Al Gore, run for president of the United States on the Democratic ticket, since he's all connected to Bill? Yes, of course he could, because if he were dynamic, charismatic, charming. But, and it's not inaccurate, Gore is a bore. I mean, it's not like a great mystery. They give him speech lessons. Clinton calls him and says, "Now look, Al, why don't you stand like this? A little more, sort of smile, crack a joke." You can't remake a whole personality. So now the Democrats, Clinton put together this coalition, but he almost wrecked it by his what? Careless behavior, and I'll never forgive him for that. And now he has following him his trusted lieutenant, who will obviously be tainted by the Clinton administration, who has a personality that's appropriate to an all-powerful royal house. Then you don't care about the personality. Just inherit the job. So here are these two parties. Both of them are vulnerable. And now what I want to ask after the break is, Gore, and will it be Bush for the Republicans or somebody else? How are they going to try to solve their problem? Please come back in 5 minutes and I'll tell you. The man who now is the front runner for the Democrats, the man who has the task of preserving the Clinton legacy, all right? Not all of the Clinton legacy. I mean, just, I want to be very careful about this. Part of the Clinton legacy. I mean, whatever you're feeling about the morality of Clinton, there's no doubt about it. As a politician, he was extraordinarily successful, winning the presidency twice and refashioning the Democratic Party. And although he was not able to hold Congress, he did turn the presidency into, for a while, a Democratic, for the capital D, institution. So the man who has that role is Al Gore, born in 1948, the son of a senator from Tennessee. So his life was in two cities, a place I've never been to. I've traveled a lot around the world. I have never been to Carthage, Tennessee. Is there anybody here who's been to Carthage, Tennessee? Oh, well, I don't know. Maybe on a next trip when I go down south, I'll pass through Carthage. But Carthage, Tennessee is his home. But he obviously was also raised in Washington, D.C., because that's where his father spent a lot of time. And his father was a very well-known Democratic senator. Ultimately, in 1976, when he was only 28 years old, he entered the U.S. House of Representatives, and then a few years later, he himself was moved up to the Senate, and he was viewed as an attractive, promising political figure, moderately progressive, and he was somebody that would be part of the photogenic team for Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, Al Gore. Certainly by 1992, that wasn't the perfect photogenic team, because it should have had maybe a woman or an Hispanic or black. But you have to understand, the Democratic Party had been redefined. That would have been too provocative. And so that seemed to be the perfect team. And in fact, they were too Southern Democrats, one from Tennessee and one from Arkansas. During the last 7 years, he has been the Vice President of the United States, the President of the Senate, and he has been the loyal aide of Bill Clinton. And certainly during the entire trouble with Clinton, although on occasion he might say something slightly negative, he has been on the whole supportive of Bill Clinton. He has been viewed as the good friend, the loyal follower, and in fact, he's in a very difficult position. You see, ethics are difficult. If I'm a teacher in the class and a kid misbehaves behind my back, throws something, I don't know, and I turn around and I say, "Who did that?" And his best friend raises his hand and says, "I cannot tell a lie. My best friend Harry did that." You got it? You got that? That's called a tattletale. We all grew up. We knew the ethics. You never ratted on friends. Would you rat on a friend? I mean, it's like a double issue. That is, there's the morality of the survival of a class, but then there is the group to which you belong, which you cannot betray. It's an ethical conflict. It's not that you're a bad guy. You're what? You're loyal to your friends and to your group. So Gore would be placed in a very difficult position. If Gore came out denouncing Clinton, he wouldn't be viewed well because he was viewed as the what? He's the loyal friend. It would be a betrayal of his loyalty to his mentor, his guide, and his friend. It wouldn't be viewed. So he's like trapped. If he doesn't do it, he's viewed as non-virtuous, and if he does do it, he's viewed as non-virtuous. Ever been in a position like that? No matter what you do, it's all wrong. So there is Gore, and he's doing personality training. He's in Charisma 2. Working very hard to develop a little charisma, whatever. But a lot of people in the Democratic Party are worried. Because certainly if it were another figure from outside who wasn't connected to Clinton, who was charismatic, who could somehow maintain the same coalition and maybe lead that coalition into victory in Congress as well, that's fine. But Gore has two strikes against him, his personality and his connection to Clinton, no matter how much he may want to deny it. And he's had problems because he has made in recent weeks remarks about both Bill and Hillary that haven't been always flattering, that have gotten back to Bill Clinton, who certainly understands that Gore has to distance himself from Clinton in order to win. But on the other hand, if you're Clinton, you get mad. And Gore has to be careful because he can't overstep. He needs Clinton, and he also has to appear to be loyal. I mean, not a good position. So now there are all kinds of people saying, Clinton did a great thing. He put this coalition together. He may not be a great man, but he did a great thing. We're Democrats. We want to stay in power, and we have a great agenda.
As the American military gets smaller, who will be there to answer the call? They will. They're the National Guard and Reserve, and they make up half of today's military forces. As an employer, you may be asked to support their mission. Remember, their response depends on yours.
He says surprising things. Like, no, I don't know where Kosovo is, but I have somebody who can tell me. And I mean, Now, if you don't know where Kosovo is and you're running for president, don't say it. Don't say a word. But the very fact that he would think it appropriate to say it out loud, why is George Bush Jr. the front runner? Now, as you know, he's the governor of Texas. He was elected twice as governor of Texas. He had been preceded by a very dynamic Democratic woman by the name of Richards as the governor of Texas, and he has proved to be a certain kind of Republican. In order to win an election in Texas, you can no longer rely on somebody else. Well, waiting in the wings is this former senator from New Jersey. His name is Bill Bradley, and he's very attractive. Basically, his agenda does not differ very much from what I would call the agenda of Clinton or Gore, but he is certainly an untainted personality, right? He has been separate, and he certainly has a little more fire. He's not the most exciting, but he has more fire, and he has been able to collect a lot of money along the way, because many people, many Democrats say, wait a minute, Gore is going to lose. He's going to take this empire, and it's going to go down the drain. Hi, Bill. Okay. And recently, I open up the New York Times, and there, at the bottom of the op-ed page, is an article by Warren Beatty. I mean, I liked him in the movies. Remember? He was pretty good in the movies. That's Shirley MacLaine's brother. So she would have seances in the White House if he made it there. So but Warren Beatty says, Bill Clinton betrayed the Democratic Party. Gore is simply a copy of Bill Clinton. It's the bad thing to be attached to. What we need to do is to go back to the old agenda of the Democratic Party, which obviously was left progressivism, which consistently lost in every presidential election, and I'm the man, and since I obviously have you-know-what, charisma, I'll be able to carry it forward. If a movie actor like Ronald Reagan can make it to the presidency, if a dancer like George Murphy can make it to the Senate, I can make it to the White House also. Right. Now we come to Bush. I have not seen his IQ test. He says surprising things. Like, no, I don't know where Kosovo is, but I have somebody who can tell me. And I mean, now, if you don't know where Kosovo is and you're running for president, don't say it. Don't say a word. But the very fact that he would think it appropriate to say it out loud, why is George Bush Jr. the front runner? Now, as you know, he's the governor of Texas. He was elected twice as governor of Texas. He had been preceded by a very dynamic Democratic woman by the name of Richards as the governor of Texas, and he has proved to be a certain kind of Republican. In order to win an election in Texas, you can no longer rely on the white Anglo-Saxon vote. There are in Texas hundreds of thousands of Hispanics. And in order to win, you've got to include Hispanics. He won a large part of the Hispanic vote when he ran for governor the first time and when he ran for governor the second time. So he has the ability, which many Republican candidates have not proved to have, he has the ability to cross the racial barrier and to include others. He also has won the vote and support of many what I call right progressives because he has a very ambiguous response to the social agenda of the conservatives. He thinks it's a mistake to outlaw abortion, although we have to be careful, we have to discourage it. I personally am totally opposed to it, but what he's saying is the old conservative agenda, which was either racial or religious, is counterproductive for the Republican Party. If we want to cut taxes, that's great. We'll win an election. And if we want to hire more police, we'll what? Win an election. But we're not going to win an election, a national election, being either racist or religious rightists. And the religious right has picked that up. They hate George Bush Jr. Now, what was very clear to many of the leaders of the Republican Party, including the people who have money, is that the last two elections were dominated by the conservatives and their poison for the Republican Party. Therefore, if we're going to have a candidate that's going to restore the Reagan coalition, then we need somebody more personable who will not be viewed as the mouthpiece of the religious right. And therefore, the man to do that is George Bush Jr. First of all, he has a distinguished ancestry. His father was president. His brother is the governor of Florida. Two, he is very personable. He is. He's sort of a regular guy, hail fellow, well met. You can't ask him to speak on any subject the way you can ask Bill Clinton, but don't ask him on Kosovo, please. He is, on occasion, in responding to issues slightly vacuous. But he's very important because he represents a moderate voice in the Republican Party. And for those people who are into success, they see him, this governor of presidential origin, attractive. He was born in 1946 in Connecticut, but his father moved from Connecticut. Now, his grandfather was a senator, a famous senator from the state of Connecticut. The president's father was the senator, and then the president moved from Connecticut to Texas. In fact, they were part of the old Eastern Republican establishment, and now they moved to Texas, and he was raised pretty much in a town called Midland, Texas. Is there anybody here who's been to Midland? There you are. See, oh, makes Carthage look like nothing. Midland, Texas. There we go. So, and he got involved with the oil world. But quite logically, he could move into politics because of his father's connection, and he did. And in Texas, he developed a strategy for the Republican Party which worked. In 1994, 1998, it's a strategy that works. You cannot exclude racial minorities. You cannot embrace the religious right. Okay. So there's George Bush Jr. And the conservatives are fit to be tied. If you get a genuine figure from the Christian coalition and you say, George Bush Jr., ooh, apoplexy. They hate him. Hate him. So now let me list the people who are his competitors, who have sought the support of the conservatives, and who say, look, this is the most loyal constituency of the Republican Party, and they have the message that will lead to victory, because in the end, the moral message is more important than the economic message, despite the fact that it was proven that all the attempts of the conservative group to establish control has failed. the last one being the impeachment of the President of the United States of America. So let me give you their names. Certainly one of the leading contenders is a man who worked for Ronald Reagan, was born in Covington, Kentucky. That's a city that's across from Cincinnati. All right. It was a casino or something there. All right, whatever. And he was born there. Ultimately, he became involved with Republican politics. He worked for Reagan, and then what he did was he became part of the religious right. And he became involved with an organization which he heads. And the key word in the religious right is the word family. Got it? You want to drop it every third word. Family. Family. It's the Family Research Council. Not money, but what? Family. Not taxes, but family. Family Research Council. And he took a leave of absence from the Family Research Council in order to be the candidate of the conservative group, representing the religious right and their agenda and their attempt to establish and maintain control of the Republican Party. There had been others that tried to speak on their behalf. The most famous one was Pat Robertson, right? And he failed, didn't make it. So there's Gary Bauer, and in fact he shows up in Iowa. And he's got circuses and refreshments and whatever. Bauer hates Bush. He thinks Bush doesn't stand for anything. Next to Bauer is the man who's very charismatic, very angry, very charismatic. Far more charismatic than George Bush Jr. His name is Pat Buchanan. Those who like him love him because he speaks straight, shoots straight, opens his mouth and he tells you the way he thinks. Now, Pat Buchanan represents the conservative agenda and in a special way because he brings up another issue, which is the conservative issue. He denounces American capitalism. American capitalism has become global. They don't care whether they open up a factory in Mexico, in Peru, in Portugal, as long as they're making money. What kind of patriotism is that? See, patriotism is an old value. Precedes capitalism. It's an old value. And all we're doing is taking jobs away from American workers. Is that not an interesting change? Out of the Republican Party, out of the conservatives, comes this denunciation of global capitalism. And so there's Pat Buchanan, and he also obviously is opposed to abortion, homosexuality, the whole thing, and he's out there. Get out of my way, Gary. I'm here. Make room for me here. Got Bauer and Buchanan now. Pat Buchanan was also a person who worked in the Reagan administration. He was a writer, and he was a gray eminence through many of the Reagan years and also during the Nixon time. Now, did I mention that black man, Alan Keyes? That's the new thing in the Republicans now. Now there are PhDs from Harvard who are black who now endorse the conservative agenda. Look at the Supreme Court. Thomas, right? Is that not a conservative Supreme Court justice? And now the agenda is no longer race. The agenda is religion and values. And Keyes gets up and he gives it to them. I'm not as a money is God Republican. I am a what? God is God Republican. And get out of the way, Gary, and move over, Pat. I'm over here. And he's very, very charismatic. If you've ever seen him when he's on talk shows, and he can take the most aggressive talk show host, and he'll take care of him. He'll shut him down. He's very, very, very good. Very effective. Now, we're coming to the candidate who spells his name K-W-A-I-L because he wasn't told that it was Q-U-A-Y-L-E-R. No, I mean, he's trying to be a voice for the conservative point of view. Quite frankly, his showing in Iowa was dreadful. He doesn't really have much get up and go, and please do not ask him the question, where is Kosovo? Okay. Now, the other person who is determined to be president is this man with this famous magazine, right? Forbes magazine, Steve Forbes, and with a lot of money. And initially, he was the mouthpiece for what I would call the capitalist agenda, and his basic plan, which isn't right progressive, it's what that old capitalist agenda is, the flat tax, right? You know, just one rate, one percentage rate for everybody. Everybody pays 6%, everybody pays 7%. Don't have graduated taxes depending on the size of your income. So that flat rate tax, and but he realized that wasn't enough. He obviously was not going to be endorsed by what we call the right progressive, so he sort of switched in the middle and became at least religious. He now is a voice for the religious. He shows up. If you're having a prayer breakfast, most likely Steve Forbes will be there. Moves it. And now he is the mouth of morality and the whole thing. So do you see all those people? They all hate Bush. They all want to replace Bush. Now, there is somebody in the race whose ideology is very close to Bush, and some people think she's much smarter. She is the wife of the former candidate for the presidency on the Republican ticket, who is now appearing in ads for Viagra. I'm trying to understand it, but I'm not clear on it. It's obviously an issue that's very important to him, otherwise he wouldn't appear in the ad. So her name is Elizabeth Dole. Some people either love her or hate her. The people who hate her think she's preachy, like a school teacher, uptight, the whole thing, and the ones who love her think she's articulate, she's brilliant, whatever else it is. Quite frankly, what she stands for isn't very different from the agenda of George Bush Jr. She represents a moderate voice in the Republican Party that wouldn't be attached to the religious right, and certainly would be open to what I call the representation of women and racial minorities and all of that. So that's Dole. Now, let me just give you some realities. Bush is very vulnerable. For a while there, he was riding high. He had raised so much money, he didn't know what to do with it. He could last for 4 campaigns. But in Iowa, he ended up, you guys understand what the straw vote is? It's a peculiar thing. It isn't a regular primary. It occurs 5 months before the first primary, which will be in, I think, New Hampshire. And what happens in Iowa is, in Ames, Iowa, they invite Republicans to come down, have a good time, and then vote. So it's about 0.25% of the Republicans who would normally vote in a primary show up in Ames, Iowa, where they are given chicken dinners and whatever. Every candidate is feeding them and whatever, and they have to pay a $25 entrance fee. And then they vote. That's the straw votes. So the number of people voting is very small, and many people say, it doesn't tell you anything. It only gives you a list of the people who like chicken dinners. But he only got, see, in order to solidify his position as the winner and for the others to go slinking off, he would need somewhere like 51 or 52%. He got 31%. And he was in trouble, and he's been in trouble because you know the question. Everybody has a skeleton somewhere in the closet. And his skeleton obviously had to do with drugs that he took over 25 years ago? And the answer to that question is not being given. He did not handle that very cleverly. It's not a sign of great intelligence, the way in which he sort of let the information out and then left it hanging where it still remains hanging. But now he's an absolute persona non grata to the conservatives, and then there are other people who wanted him to be morally perfect and now have some kind of reservation about him. So he is vulnerable. Gore is vulnerable because there are lots of Democrats I know who sit around thinking, we've got to find somebody. Got to find somebody other than Gore. We got to do it. He knows that. Now, I want to point out something. In terms of the economic and social agenda, the difference between Bush and Gore is minimal. It's not great. What is a great difference is that although Bush's agenda is moderate, the party which he will represent has within it a large body of religious conservatives who have an entirely different agenda. But, I mean, they're like variations. Gore's stand on abortion is more clear-cut. Gore's defense of public schools is a little bit more clear-cut. But the differences are not overwhelming. What's interesting is that the conservative line is changing, and it has changed since the impeachment. And I want to talk about this. I'm so amazed by it. At one time, when the Cold War was on, the conservatives were in favor of invading any country that might have a what? A communist government, and overthrowing it. An aggressive foreign policy. And in fact, America, as the representative of moral right, had the right to do that. Now the conservatives are changing. Bauer and Buchanan opposed Clinton on intervention in Kosovo. And let me give you the reasoning that they give, which is an interesting one. And it shows how burned they were by the impeachment. We Americans have first to reform ourselves morally before we go out and teach others. It is very clear that the moral fiber of our nation has been broken. Bill Clinton got away, didn't he? Got away with it. And he got away with it because the American people let him get away with it, which means we have moral laxity around it. Who are we to go invading any country? Our job is first of all what? To put our own moral house in order. And therefore we should not take the American army under any circumstances, go to any other country, invade, help, whatever else it is, because our first and urgent task is here. So it's a return to the isolationism that existed before World War II, because after World War II, the Republicans were all out there, let's go out and make sure that the communists don't move. It's an interesting change. So there were two forces that were opposed to the Clinton intervention. One was a magazine on the left progressive, The Nation, and Pat Buchanan and Gary Bauer. Isn't that interesting? So there's a cultural war going on. One of the realities is there's a cultural war going on between those who have the conservative agenda and those who resist. And what the conservatives want to do is to split the anti-conservative forces so that they can control the government. And for those who are opposed to that conservative agenda, it's very important to paste together all the other forces in order to keep the conservatives out, depending on your own conviction. Now, part of that cultural war is expressed now in an education war. One of the clever things the conservative agenda has now introduced, which may provide federal funding and state funding for religious schools, is the voucher system. Oh. And in fact, given the behavior of the union in Detroit and whatever else it is, it's very clear that thousands and thousands of people who have no interest in the conservative agenda are now being driven to finding alternative education for their children and would like the state to help them support that child in some kind of private school. So the conservatives have now touched on an issue to draw in people, I would call them right progressives. Sort of draw them in. It's a very, very, very powerful issue. And in fact, Gore has expressed opposition to vouchers, Bush waffles. It's sort of yes. It's more yes than no. There is a Democratic rebellion brewing. It's not Warren Beatty. It's going to be the leaders of the Democratic Party worried about the chances of Gore to win. I'm not sure that they can reverse things now without an enormous embarrassment, but what will happen in the next few months will determine that. And there is this Republican rebellion encouraged by the straw vote in Ames, Iowa, which is he only got 31%. We're going to get Bush. And the alternative to Bush most likely won't be Elizabeth Dole. The alternative to Bush would be some figure that represents that conservative voice. Well, Bush actually was number one in the poll. Coming in at 21% was Forbes, interestingly enough. And third was Elizabeth Dole. Coming in 8 out of 9 was Dan Quayle. So Dan Quayle's pretty much eliminated. Alan Keyes came in very low. He most likely is eliminated, although he never thought he would get it anyway, so he may just continue to what? Go around and have a good time, be invited to all the shows, and do his thing. And another man who withdrew, whose name I didn't put on the board, is that man from Tennessee. He's been trying very hard. Sort of a moderate voice. His name is Lamar Alexander, and he tries and he tries. Harold Stassen. Do you remember him? All right, okay. All right. So what's the implications of it all? Well, right now at this stage, polls seem to indicate that if Bush is the candidate, that the Republicans have a slight edge. And that slight edge comes from the fact that if you are a moderate, you have a choice between Gore and Bush. And if you're a little sick of what we call the Clinton scandal, then you'll shift your moderate vote from Gore to Bush. You wouldn't do it to Forbes or to Bauer, but you might do it to George Bush Jr. After all, it's a moderate voice. There will be increasing pressure on Gore to withdraw, because I think, and I hate to predict, I think no matter how many lessons he's going to get. It's cruel to say, I really don't want to say it. I doubt that he will be able to change, and it may be very clear the Democratic Party would be better off having a candidate who was not linked directly to the Clinton administration, but removing him may be very, very hard. But again, and this is the game, and this is the center of everything I've said this morning, in order to win the election, you have to paste together several agendas. No single agenda has a majority. If you want to defeat the conservatives, you have to put together at least the right progressives, the capitalists, and the left progressives, some kind of an alliance. And that is the alliance the Democrats put together under Clinton. The Republicans have a more difficult situation. If they give up the conservatives who are now threatening to organize their own third party, they keep doing that. They had another meeting in Manchester, New Hampshire, whatever. Senator Smith from New Hampshire, we're leaving, we're a third party, whatever. The problem is that if you exclude the conservatives, what I call the capitalist agenda and the right progressives are not enough for that majority. And it's highly unlikely that left progressives will move over to the Republican Party. So that's the bind. The bind is we have to keep the conservatives in the party, but we have to what? Keep them down. And that battle is not easy. So, let me simply say, I sent a little note to George Bush Jr. with a map showing him exactly where Kosovo is. Thank you very, very much.